Hello interwebs, I hope you're doing well, because you're getting an extra video from me this week, because I felt a need to talk around a certain topic that's gotten a lot of discourse this week, specifically the discourse surrounding comedian Dave Chappelle and his new Netflix special, The Closer, and jokes that he made in it that many people have deemed to be transphobic. For example, within the special, he said he supported J.K. Rowling's stance on transgender people, and he even said that he was, quote, Team TERF. And of course, those statements are deeply, deeply charged, and of course caused a lot of LGBTQ rights groups like GLAAD to condemn the special, and also started generating a lot of discourse and discussion, not only within the LGBTQ and the transgender community, but also the black community as well. TERFs also got in on this conversation, conservatives and a whole bunch of other people all kind of started talking about this special for numerous different reasons. And obviously the first and most obvious one is that discourse that always kind of comes up with this type of, discourse around comedians making possibly offensive jokes, that people are being too sensitive or not getting the joke, or comedians are complaining that they aren't able to make good jokes anymore. See Bill Burr or Bill Maher or Ricky Gervais for examples of that. And then there's other folks on the other side saying like, no, these comedians are being just that. They're being transphobic. They're being homophobic. And that has been kind of how mainly this discussion around Dave Chappelle has been framed, that it's just sort of the discourse about like, oh, people are being too sensitive. You're making transphobic jokes. That it's sort of that go at each other sort of culture war discussion that we've had. And yet, I feel like, having watched the special, that this specific situation around Dave Chappelle actually goes a lot deeper than that discourse. And I think this discussion actually hits upon some really interesting specific intersections of how we talk about issues of race, transphobia, LGBTQ issues in general, and especially in the context of when we talk about it when criticizing someone like Dave Chappelle, a black man. And I think that this is especially pertinent because this is something that Chappelle himself directly addressed within the entire special. I think that's kind of the whole centering of the point of the special. And so I feel like the fact that this has just been diluted to that culture war conversation has kind of missed the larger discourse that should be going on, to just dilute the whole conversation to being Dave Chappelle made some transphobic jokes and we should either defend him or not defend him depending on which side of the culture war that we're on. And it goes much deeper than that because, again, nuance is a thing. And so I want to dive deeper into this because I think there's a lot more intersections here that we need to discuss around this special and how we talk about trans issues in a nuanced way within also intersecting discussions with the black community and other communities and things like that. So let's get into that. But before we dive in, I do need to put a few disclaimers on this. The first thing first is I'm going to give my whole opinion on this whole discussion, including my thoughts on Dave Chappelle's jokes and his special. But my intention with this video, as with everything, is never to cancel or hate someone. I will be calling out stuff that I take issue with, and I will make my stance known. But my reasoning for doing videos like this is never to condemn a person or cancel a person. I don't find that to be particularly useful in these types of discussions. Instead, my goal, as usual, is to use a topical conversation to dive at the heart of an issue, because I think that this is just indicative of a larger conversation that we need to have. And this is a conversation that I don't claim to have a definitive answer on. But what I'm going to do is just give you the information about the context that it sits within so you can make up your own mind, while also at least trying to provide my own perspective on it as well, but also trying to make the distinction clear where my perspective is and where there's sort of the context that's going on here, and trying to be understanding of both sides of the issue. While I will be critical of Chappelle, and believe me, I will be very critical of Chappelle throughout this video, this conversation it needs to be more complex than just saying Chappelle is bad, because I think he also has some really salient points in the special that have been completely removed from the larger discourse that I'm going to try to at least bring back up into the conversation. And secondly, what should be quite obvious is I am a white trans woman talking about race. So while I'm going to be providing my commentary, I'm also going to try my best to include or at least point to some perspectives from some in the black community. And I'll put some of those links down in the description below. I'll quote a few people within this video, but I also encourage you to seek out more than just the ones that I provided, especially because, like the trans and larger LGBTQ community as a whole, the black community is not a monolith with a singular opinion. So it's worthwhile to just look at the larger discussion that's been going on here, because again, I do think that this needs to be a conversation, not a dictation on what way to feel one way or the other. So with all those qualifiers out of the way, let's get into this. So I think the best place to start is with the specific jokes that have gotten the most attention within the special. So let's take a look at what actually Dave Chappelle said and break down why people found them to be particularly offensive. And again, keep in mind, I'm going to add more depth and nuance to this discussion beyond just calling Dave Chappelle transphobic, but I am going to start off by talking about why these specific jokes are offensive to trans folks.
Cancel J.K. Rowling. My God, J.K. Rowling wrote all the Harry Potter books by herself. And they canceled her because she said in an interview, and this is not exactly what she said, but effectually, she said gender was a fact. And then the trans community got mad as shit. They started calling her a TERF. I didn't even know what the fuck that was.
So this was the joke that got the most attention, with him defending J.K. Rowling and her words. Now, in the special, Chappelle frames what J.K. Rowling said as simply being gender is a fact, which is actually far and away from what she actually said. Now, I've done a whole video on the specifics of what J.K. Rowling said, so if you want to know the nitty-gritty of that discussion, you can check it out there. But to kind of summarize that video and J.K. Rowling's essay, what J.K. Rowling did say was not gender is a fact. But what she did do was use a ton of misinformation and fear-mongering tactics in order to try to invalidate the identity of trans people, specifically transgender women. For example, Rowling cited the work of Lisa Lightman, who did this work on rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is this bunk science idea which alleges that young assigned female at birth folks, people who were seen as girls from their birth, are coming out as transgender at this huge rate due to social media, making transness sound like a fad that you can just get in on and get in on the trend. But what Rowling neglects to mention when she cites Lisa Lightman's study was how that study was actually begging the question, as all the results of that study come out of a survey that was posted on sites from parents that were already worried about rapid onset gender dysphoria. So she was kind of really begging the question with that study, is like, oh, there's a lot of people that are worried about rapid onset gender dysphoria and seeing these symptoms, because she only asked people who were seeing those symptoms and worried about rapid onset gender dysphoria. So the methodology of Lightman's work has been incredibly questioned. And then also, J.K. Rowling also leaned into this fear-mongering idea of detransitioners, saying that there's this huge wave of girls who have harmed their bodies with surgeries trying to be trans, only to later learn that they aren't trans and have done irreversible damages to themselves with hormones and surgeries and things like that. And this can happen, and I've done videos on that, but the number of detransitioners within the trans community is incredibly small. There's been numerous studies that have found that very few people actually detransition. Between, some studies say 8% and some studies say as small as 2% of trans people do that. And even within those numbers, most of the people do detransition for reasons other than thinking that transition isn't right for them. Like, for example, being in an area where transition isn't safe or not having enough money to transition, things like that. With the number of people who actually detransition who believe that they shouldn't have started transitioning in the first place was around 0.4% of the people that detransition. So a very small percentage of an already very small percentage. And even of that small percentage, very few of those people have done irreversible damage to their bodies, like with things like surgeries. So yes, detransitioners are an issue, and I'm not unsympathetic towards that. We definitely need to be talking about that. And again, I have in several videos. But instead of trying to argue that we need to do better in terms of understanding trans healthcare, being more affirming, being, setting up sort of good ways to understand trans healthcare, J.K. Rowling in her essay actually argued to stop trans-affirming healthcare, to stop actually trying to give more tools for trans people and helping trans people understand themselves, and specifically take away trans-affirming care from trans children. And also in that essay, she constantly invalidated trans women as women and also infantilized trans men, saying that they might just be confused women, denying their right to identify as themselves. So there's a lot of problems with J.K. Rowling's essay, not the least of which that all of these are similar talking points and ideologies aligned with trans exclusionary radical feminists, aka TERFs. Like much of what J.K. Rowling said were basically just the talking points of many TERF groups. In fact, what she says is basically the outline for books like Abigail Shrier's Irreversible Damage, which is a book that is sort of one of the leading TERF books that's filled with the same misinformation, bad studies, and more that J.K. Rowling states, and sort of the fear-mongering about detransitioners and things like that. So J.K. Rowling did much more than just say gender is a fact. And also the fact that she's using TERF ideology is something that Dave Chappelle is aware of and brings up in the special.
So I looked it up. TERF is an acronym. Stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminists. This is a real thing. This is a group of women that hate transgender. They don't hate transgender women, but they look at trans women the way we blacks might look at blackface. It offends them. Like, ooh, this bitch is doing an impression of me.
So here Dave Chappelle does a couple other interesting things. He kind of does the same thing that he did with J.K. Rowling, saying that, all they're saying is just something totally understandable and normal. Yet the one example he uses is that TERFs are saying that trans people are like blackface for women. So there's a few things with that. Firstly, like J.K. Rowling, I've done a whole video on TERFs and where their ideology comes from and why they're so harmful specifically to trans people, but also to just women's rights in general, not just trans rights. So check out that video for that deeper dive. But let's specifically hone in on that blackface example here. What blackface was a practice done by white people in vaudeville and early film, and let's be honest, still to this day in a lot of cases, done to explicitly mock and make fun of black people. That's the history of blackface. Blackface was there to mock black people. The whole intention of it was to insult black folks. But as Dave Chappelle himself says within this special, trans women are women. So to compare someone's identity, the very fact that trans women are women, and compare our personhood, our sense of self, to mocking of womanhood, mocking an identity, it has this implication that trans women's identities are not only invalid, but are intentionally mockeries of womanhood. That we're not actually women, but we're just making fun of what women are. It kind of implicitly frames trans women as intentionally condescending and sexist just through our basic existence and our basic sense of self. And so to compare trans women's existence to blackface is deeply offensive. Now, Dave Chappelle in the special doesn't say that that is what he is saying, but he does just state it as that's just simply the TERF ideology. Number one, kind of normalizing it as like, oh yeah, that's an okay thing to be, and not the like actual horrible comparison that it is. And it also perpetuates this negative implication and normalizes that belief that TERFs have. And also this perpetuation of the negative connotation of trans people that were, intentionally deceptive, harmful mocking of womanhood is exactly what TERFs want to perpetuate in society. Because while Chappelle states that TERFs just believe this one thing, that that's all they're saying, that's not actually the case. For those of you who don't know, TERFs are actually an active dogmatic hate group that specifically targets trans people. Again, I did a whole video going into the specifics of that. To give you a little bit of a short list, for example, TERFs actively campaign with right-wing hate groups like the Heritage Foundation. The WOLF, which is a TERF group, actually actively promotes that they do that on their site, despite the fact that the Heritage Foundation has done a lot to harm women's rights and actually has done a lot of campaigning against women's rights, like abortion access and things like that. We also see things like vocal TERFs like Posey Parker have been platformed by alt-right groups. Many conservative newspapers and groups that are, anti-transgender, anti-LGBTQ, anti-women's rights also platform TERF ideas and people. TERFs have also actively campaigned against trans-affirming healthcare for trans youth. They've also helped promote legislation in both the UK and the US denying trans rights and trans access to healthcare, especially for kids. And similarly, TERF groups like the WOLF, who I mentioned before, have also actively campaigned against the expansion of LGBTQ rights if any of these expansions of LGBTQ rights have any affirmations of trans people within them. Also, many self-proclaimed TERFs online actively harass and dead-name transgender people in online spaces like Twitter, which is a practice that often leads to mental health issues and suicidal ideation for transgender folks in real life. I myself have faced a lot of harassment from TERFs and things like that, though that's somewhat beside the point. TERFs have also participated and helped to push protests that have sometimes led to violence against transgender people and trans allies, and they've also tried to incite violence against trans people in a lot of different cases. The point that I'm trying to get at is that TERFs are not just an ideological difference of opinion that you're just saying like, oh, trans people are offensive to womanhood. They're an active hate group. They actively try to harm and attack transgender people. And so to frame them as just an ideological difference, as something like, oh yeah, it's a normal opinion to have, that Dave Chappelle is sort of putting out there, it denies the very real harm that TERFs cause to trans women and trans people in general, as well as women in general, trans or cisgender, and cisgender being basically, not transgender. That's what that term means. And it's also normalizing their harmful rhetoric. It's pushing it into the mainstream, especially when Chappelle himself then goes on to say that he is Team TERF.
I'm Team TERF. I agree, man. Gender is a fact.
Now, we're going to lay aside that Team TERF comment for now. We'll be coming back to it in just a moment. But right after that, whether he intended to do this or not, the next few jokes that Chappelle makes after this moment do lean into the same rhetoric about trans people that TERFs play into.
Gender is a fact. This is a fact. Every human being in this room, every human being on Earth had to pass through the legs of a woman to be on Earth. That is a fact. Now, I am not saying that to say that trans women aren't women. I am just saying that those pussies that they got, you know what I mean? I'm not saying it's not pussy, but that's like beyond pussy or impossible pussy, you know what I mean? It tastes like pussy, but that's not quite what it is it? It's not blood, that's beet juice.
In these next few jokes, Dave Chappelle brings up the fact, this is a fact, that a lot of trans women can't give birth and that we don't have periods. And this is true. Many trans women who have had a vaginoplasty, like myself, we can't give birth. And also, while a lot of us do have certain, hormonal cycles, like monthly hormonal cycles due to being on HRT, like, for example, I get bloating and sort of emotional cycles of anxiety and frustration on a, sort of a monthly basis as well due to hormones. I don't have a period in the same sense that a cis woman does. I don't shed my uterine lining every single month. That is absolutely true. And for the most part, no trans person is really saying otherwise. No one's arguing that we are. No one's arguing that we do have periods like cis women do. No one's saying that our vaginas are exactly the same as cis women's. We're never arguing that we're exactly the same. They are different. My vagina is different from a cis woman's vagina. And we have different needs and some similar needs, but different needs and worries when it comes to our vaginal health and our bodily health and things like that. And no trans woman is really denying that fact. So the question I have for, Dave Chappelle is, so what? Like, what's the point of bringing that up other than for like a cheap joke that I've heard a billion times before? It's like, oh, trans women can't give birth. And I say that as sort of a leading thing because the reason he's bringing that up is it kind of goes into the same sort of ideology that TERFs are bringing up, that not being able to have a period, not be able to give birth is somehow making you less of a woman. In fact, a lot of TERFs frame the discussion around trans people exactly this way, essentializing womanhood to just having a uterus and being able to give birth and having periods, focusing on that as like the only way that women are oppressed and the only way that you can be a valid woman. Basically, they're just kind of like Batman in Dawn of Justice, just asking eternally, like, do you bleed? In order to justify if you're a woman, is a weird way to think about womanhood. I mean, certainly, yes, there are many ways that women are oppressed for their reproductive health care and reproductive rights. I mean, just look at the awful, awful bill in Texas denying many women abortions and sort of legalizing, people suing people for getting an abortion. It's really, really awful and definitely a way that women are oppressed, for sure. But to essentialize womanhood in the ability to procreate and the ability to have a period is often what many right wings and conservative groups try to do in general to justify sexist legislation and also justify returning to traditional gender roles and norms, where women are like the housekeepers, the homekeepers, the person to take care of the kids, that sort of thing. And it also denies that there are many cisgender women who can't give birth, who don't have periods for numerous reasons, whether, they're older, have gone through menopause, are, just have a hormonal imbalance that causes them to not be able to have periods or give birth, are, sterile from birth, things like that. They are no less a woman than any other woman, and same thing with trans women. Just because we can't give birth or have periods and our vaginas are different than other women's, and by the way, everyone's vagina is different, doesn't make us any less of a woman. So to essentialize womanhood this way, as TERFs do, as they center their womanhood on these things, is to deny womanhood not only to trans women, but many cis women, and to really sort of misunderstand the complex ways in which women are oppressed and which you can also identify and be a woman. Even further, TERFs also try to frame trans women who have had surgery, such as myself, as mutilated. They call our genitals like mutilated penises, framing us as like gross, disfigured monsters instead of just being people with vaginas that are different. I'm not saying my vagina is the same as a cis woman's vagina, but it's dehumanizing to call a part of my body, a part of me, regardless of whether I had it from surgeries or not, to call it disfigured, to call me a monster because of that. It's deeply dehumanizing language. It's a part of my body. It's a part of who I am. I sought it, and yes, I got it from surgeries. But would you call someone who got like other surgeries, who had something done on the face, would you call them disfigured or mutilated or monstrous? I don't think you would accept that as okay things to say. Yet, that's the exact rhetoric that TERFs use, and it's the exact rhetoric that Dave Chappelle is playing off of with his jokes here. So, this is all why a lot of people have taken issue with Dave Chappelle's words as being transphobic, because that's what they are. He's, normalizing harmful TERFs groups. He's belittling trans identities and women's identities at the same time as a whole, and sort of normalizing and playing off of and using transphobic rhetoric. That's what these jokes are doing. Now, there's even more stuff that people have also called out throughout the special, like, for example, he uses Caitlyn Jenner's dead name, and he refers to trans women as men throughout the entire video. He also does similar things of, like, pointing out, like, masculine features of trans women, like, our huge hands, or, like, broad shoulders, or whatever, things like that. Kind of getting at that same idea of, like, trans people as monstrous, or weird, or different, or strange. But these jokes that I specifically outlined are sort of the biggest ones that people have taken major issue with, because they are so directly leaning into and supporting and normalizing transphobic hate groups. And so, quite obviously, because of that, Dave Chappelle got a ton of flack for these jokes from a lot of different groups. A lot of different groups condemned his special, including GLAAD, who I mentioned before, as well as the National Black Justice Coalition, which is a civil rights advocacy group that focuses specifically on Black LGBTQ folks. And here's a quick statement from the executive director, David Johns, on Dave Chappelle's special. With 2021 on track to be the deadliest year on record for transgender people in the United States, the majority of whom are Black transgender people, Netflix should know better. Perpetuating transphobia perpetuates violence. Netflix should immediately pull the closer from its platform and directly apologize to the transgender community. There are many in the trans community who have also called out these jokes as transphobic, including many trans women who work for Netflix, which is where the special aired. The most notable of these trans women was Jocelyn Moore, who is a trans woman and a showrunner of Netflix's Dear White People. And because of this special, she quit working for Netflix after the special was released. She sort of put her foot down and said that she did not want to work with Netflix anymore after the release of the special because of these jokes. And so all of this has been kind of the overriding discourse about Dave Chappelle's special, that a lot of his jokes are transphobic, leaning into this transphobic rhetoric, and a lot of it coming from the trans community. And then, as I said, there's been other groups on the other side of this that have sort of culture warred this whole thing, being like, oh, you're just trying to cancel Dave Chappelle. And I should say, for my own self, I do find these specific jokes that Dave Chappelle is making to be harmful, for all the reasons that I said. Yet, that being said, I think these jokes also sit within a larger context within the special itself, and even more especially within the context of the commentary that Chappelle is actually trying to drive at with the special as a whole. Because this whole special by Dave Chappelle is kind of framed around talking about LGBTQ issues, trans issues, Black issues in a very complicated way that I think in some ways he gets really, really done well and really, really right and actually intelligently dissects it, and in some ways is deeply, deeply harmful. And I think we need to look at that larger context to really analyze what he's saying in the larger discussion. And I think the way we can start looking at that is looking at the fact that Dave Chappelle is heavily aware that this type of discourse around his work was probably going to happen because it's happened before. And it's something that he brings up and openly discusses within the special itself.
I was doing a nightclub in Oakland 16 years ago, and this is the first time that the trans community ever got mad at me that I knew about. And I was nobody. I just quit Chappelle's show. It was like a nothing hole-in-the-wall club, and I was doing some transgender jokes in Oakland. It was 16 years ago. My pronoun game was not as nice as it is today. I went too far. I said things like and shit. I didn't know these words were bad. And a woman stood up and just gave me the business. Started screaming at me. And I'm sure it was a woman. But she kept calling me transphobic and all this shit. I'd never even heard these words before. It's really weird. I didn't trip. I just gave security the look like, get that bitch out of here. I kept it moving. And then she went to the press, and the next day, one of the gay papers wrote all the same things she had said to me about me in the paper. Misquoted the jokes and was calling me transphobic. And again, all these words, I'd never heard them before, but every time that I talk with anybody from that community since, they always repeat the talking points from that article. My least favorite of which being, and I hate this phrase, they say I was punching down on them. Punching down. The fuck does that mean?
Dave Chappelle is actually making a very interesting point at this point in the special. He's pointing out that earlier in his career, he made jokes that were deemed to be transphobic, like the jokes that he's making today, with things like him using the T-word slur. And in a lot of ways, him pointing this out makes sense that, he did not know, even though he got called transphobic, he did not know that this was offensive. I mean, while trans people have always existed throughout history, we've existed for as long as human history has existed, trans issues have only really become a kind of mainstream discussion within the past decade or so, at least here within the United States. And as such, because there's been a lot less awareness, a lot less study, a lot less understanding of trans issues, it's kind of a constantly evolving conversation that we're kind of having about trans people. And it's one that everyone is kind of at different places on, especially if they don't have a lot of access to the trans community, to trans people, to talking with trans people. I mean, for example, RuPaul helped to popularize the T-slur on his show, RuPaul's Drag Race. He normalized a word that is often used derogatorily against the trans community. But the thing is, RuPaul is not a trans woman, but a drag queen. But an average person, especially years ago, might not have known the difference between a drag queen and a trans woman. And so RuPaul would be like the first touchstone that many people would have into anything even closely resembling the trans community. And so many might figure, because RuPaul was using the T-slur quite often, that they would think that, oh, he's using it, so it's a fine word for me to use, not understanding the history of it being a slur. And so I can understand why Dave Chappelle would not be fully aware of the dramatic impact that the T-slur would have. And that's just kind of one example of many that we could point to and look at within Dave Chappelle's works. I mean, I'm not going to go through every single history of Dave Chappelle's jokes, but it kind of always has that undertone of like, possibly we can give him the benefit of the doubt of not knowing, while still calling him out for the fact that, like, hey, you're using your platform to talk about trans people without being fully aware of the trans issues. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the thing that I want to drive at for this point is, like, there's a certain amount of goodwill that we could give to Dave Chappelle when looking at his intentions and place within talking about trans people. Again, that's not forgiving him for those jokes. And if I'm being fair, I would even go so far as to argue that his jokes about TERFs in this video kind of fall into the same category, because TERFs today are very, very good at disguising their rhetoric as, just normal feminism. For example, in the United Kingdom, TERFs have kind of successfully framed the entire debate on trans issues in, UK journalism and academia as if it's a fight between women's issues and trans issues, that it's like women and trans people fighting each other, when that's not actually the case. What the discussion actually is and should be is the discussion of women's rights as a whole, trans or not, and how trans and cis women have different issues and have both aligning and different fights and discussions to be had about, our rights, our healthcare, our needs, and how many trans women and cis women have similar fights but also have different fights as well. But TERFs, their entire intention is to divert that conversation and instead use misleading or false information to hide their harmful agenda. I could even say in this latest special, Dave Chappelle's words may be coming from a place of ignorance, not knowing how harmful TERFs are. And don't worry, I am going to be not giving him a pass on those TERF jokes. This isn't me trying to sort of say, oh, it was okay. And we'll come back to that in a second. But to stay on topic, Dave Chappelle does argue that in the past he was unaware of how the harm of his words came across, but that he got attacked vitriolically for them anyways by the trans community. And not just in public opinion, but in how he was treated every day by trans people and trans allies and trans-affirming people that he met in everyday life. He even points out a few of these individual incidents that happened in person in his special.
And then she goes, would you like to see her picture? Oh, now I don't want to see this woman's picture, but what am I going to do? I go, okay, yeah, sure, I'd love to see the picture. And I grab the picture, and this is all I say. Oh, she's very beautiful. And as she puts the picture away, she looks mean all of a sudden, like she caught me in some kind of trap. What does that face mean? And then she goes, she's transgender. And I think to myself, oh, this bitch does know who I am. I really resented that trap.
And this is another very interesting point by Dave Chappelle, that in these conversations that he's having, There's a lack of understanding where he is at and where he's coming from, wanting to be affirming to trans people, wanting to understand trans people, but not being fully aware of all the different trans issues and ways to talk about trans people. And so he feels that people are coming at him ready to argue with him, to attack him, rather than looking at him as a complex human being who wants to be affirming, but is still learning. And him wanting to ask for empathetic conversations rather than people just being ready to come up and attack him. And I understand that. This is a true thing that really does happen. We tend to assume the intentions and ideas of others as negative. And it's kind of a product of how we've been polarized and how we've been told to interact with each other, especially in online spaces today. We're always ready to attack each other because we're always framed on this side of the culture war debate as you're either this thing or this thing, and I hate you if you're that thing. And we can't, actually come together to have an empathetic conversation and have a nuanced discussion. And so I hear his point on this topic, because I don't really think Dave Chappelle is being actively hateful towards trans people. I don't think that's his intention. But instead, I think he's navigating trans issues publicly on a large stage in a way that is relatable for many people who are also navigating trans issues privately by themselves, especially folks who are not regularly exposed to the trans community. And I think we can see this in the special itself, how far Dave Chappelle has come and how much he wishes to actually be affirming to trans people, because he shows within the special a few times how far he's actually moved on trans issues. He even makes a really funny bit about how to affirm trans people in the bathroom.
Before I even say anything about that community, you must know, and I hope you all feel the same way, I am not indifferent to the suffering of someone else. There's laws, the mean laws. In our country, North Carolina passed a law once that said a person in North Carolina must use the restroom that corresponds with the gender they were assigned on their birth certificate. No. No, that's not a good law. That's a mean law. No American should have to present a birth certificate to take a shit at Walmart in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the baby shot and killed a motherfucker. You have to ask yourself, if you're thinking about it, who are these laws designed to protect? Like, let's say they designed this law to protect me, my interests, transphobic comedian Dave Chappelle. And let's say that I'm in Walmart doing a little shopping with my family. Now, I should tell you, if that ever happens in real life, you should know that my dreams didn't work out. But let's say something goes horribly wrong, and there I am in Walmart with the poor whites rummaging around for mediocre goods and services. And then I gotta go to the restroom. So I excuse myself from my family. I go to the men's room. Now I'm standing at the urinal taking a leak. And this is what this law is gonna do. And suddenly, a woman walks into the men's room. I'm gonna be like, that's strange. And then she stands shoulder to shoulder with me at the urinal. I'm gonna be like, bitch, what's going on with you? And then she hikes her skirt up and pulls a real live meaty dick out. And what do you think I'm gonna say? Thank God she's in here with me. At least now I know my family's safe. No, I'm not gonna feel that way at all. I'm gonna feel very uncomfortable. I would feel better if it was a man with a vagina.
Now, yes, in that clip that I just aired, Dave Chappelle does lean into, harmful ways of describing trans people. Like, he alludes to trans women as men. He focuses on, typically masculine coded features of his theoretical trans person who's in the bathroom with him and things like that. Focus on genitals and things like that as well. I know very few trans women who would use a urinal as well. It's a kind of a situation that doesn't really happen. And so all of that is a problematic way of discussing this issue. But the larger point that he's making in that joke is that he wants trans people to have the right to use the bathroom that they identify with, that we identify with. This is still a fight that trans women are fighting right now. We're trying to battle legislation that's just trying to force us to use the wrong bathroom, placing us into harmful situations, and also forcing trans people to feel unwelcome in public spaces because we don't feel comfortable or safe being able to use the bathroom. And we often get harassed even if we are legally allowed to use the women's bathroom. And Dave Chappelle even goes even further in this discussion to talk about how we should recognize how these types of legislations that directly target trans people are used to benefit non-transgender people, used to benefit cisgender people and powerful folks at the expense of trans people. So despite the untactful, just to be nice and generous, way that he discusses trans people and trans issues in this segment, his point of trans people should be able to use the bathroom and that legislation is sometimes used to target trans people is a really deep one that I think a lot of people are still trying to catch up on. And it shows for Dave Chappelle that he has shown a deep growth on trans issues in himself in just the past few years. This is not something he would have said just a few short years ago. And I think it's reflective. I think Dave Chappelle as a person is reflective of how the common awareness of trans people has shifted a lot in just a few short years. How a lot of people, just a few short years ago would not be understanding of trans women in the bathroom, but now because of the larger cultural conversation, a lot of people have moved, and Dave Chappelle in many ways reflects that. And so the point that all of this is sort of touching upon is that, yes, Dave Chappelle has actually grown a lot, and yes, he makes a great point about how he's still learning, how he's still not fully aware of every single thing within the trans discourse, and how sometimes he is not given enough empathy in conversations, both within the public discourse and one-on-one conversations, to have that ability to learn and grow and understand where his intentions are coming from. Now, I do have some critical things to say about that, but I want to put a pin in it because I think we also need to talk about the other thing that Dave Chappelle is using this special for, because I think Chappelle also brings up really excellent points about how these discussions of trans issues, feminist issues, LGBTQ issues, how they intersect specifically with race.
I have a question for the audience, and this is a real question. I'm not joking around. Is it possible that a gay person can be racist? Do you really think so? Of course it's possible. You guys are confusing the emotions. You think I hate gay people, and what you're really seeing is that I am jealous of gay people. Oh, I'm jealous. I'm not the only black person that feels this way. We blacks, we look at the gay community and we go, God damn it, look how well that movement is going.
Dave Chappelle brings up a really interesting point here. Often when we discuss LGBTQ rights in sort of a mainstream way, it often frames white people at the center of the discourse, specifically white LGBTQ people. And also look at the fact, and I am fully aware that I am also a white trans woman on YouTube, but look at the fact that a lot of the most public-facing trans people on platforms like YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, other areas as well in mainstream media, often the biggest trans people that we're talking about are white trans people. And the same thing goes for a lot of the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of gay white folks that we focus on, gay lesbians, gay bisexual people. There's a lot of focus on the white aspects of the LGBTQ community. We don't necessarily give a lot of attention to the black LGBTQ community as well, in the same way and the same amount. And I think that that is a really salient point that Dave Chappelle is making. I mean, even specifically talking about Dave Chappelle's special, the discourse that's going on right now about this whole special, the main person who has sort of been platformed as in opposition to Dave Chappelle, the person who is framed as the opposite side of the discourse, which I don't think that's what she's actually saying if you look at her words, but the person that's there's Dave Chappelle, and then the biggest criticizer of him is a white trans woman who used to work for Netflix. And, in fact, I actively tried to find, people, black trans women, who were talking about Dave Chappelle's special one way or the other, and I could not find a whole lot of them, and none of them on any mainstream news media sites, mostly just Twitter discourse stuff. No black trans women have been platformed on any sort of news media site discussing Dave Chappelle's special, at least not that I could immediately find. And if you do find them, please let me know. I'd love to put them down in the links below. I'd love to see that and do my own learning on that front as well. But this is something that happens all the time. The centering of white voices, not only within the LGBTQ community, but in how the media centers LGBTQ issues, how it centers them in a white-focused way, and often centers LGBTQ issues without ever talking about or acknowledging Black issues within that community. There's also a whole separate discourse that has kind of happened as well around Jaylene Moore being a white woman working as a showrunner for the show Dear White People, a show that talks about issues facing the Black community. And I think that that is a very interesting and also important discussion to be had as well. The fact that there are a lot of Black showrunners on that show, and that the show is led by the showrunner Justin Simien, who has worked on every single episode, directed many episodes of the show, has been working on it for the entire time the show's been on Netflix, right up until the series finale. And also the fact that the show talks about LGBTQ issues, and so that might speak to why Moore was hired to talk about that intersection between Black issues and LGBTQ issues. Though it's also worthwhile to have a discussion about why a Black trans woman writer was not hired for that position. So there's a larger discourse there, but I do think that it is somewhat ancillary to this discussion, but I also think it somewhat touches upon what Chappelle is talking about in this special, that we center a lot of discourses around white folks within the LGBTQ community, because now we're talking about her and not the substance of Dave Chappelle's special. Even when Moore herself is, if you look at what she said in an interview with Variety, is saying pretty much the same things that I'm saying kind of right here. It's not really become about that. It's become about like, hey, there's a white trans woman who is in opposition to Dave Chappelle. And I think Dave Chappelle even shows an even greater depth at understanding this issue as well, because he also points to the intersection of privilege that many white LGBTQ folks have, like myself.
Then, right when you think we would fight, guess what he did? He picked up his phone and he called the police. And this thing I'm describing is a major issue that I have with that community. Gay people are minorities until they need to be white again. I'm telling you right now, a Black gay person would have never done that to me. Because a Black gay person knows when the police shows up, they're not gonna care who called them.
As Chappelle points out numerous times within this special, LGBTQ folks are an oppressed minority. But if we're white folks within the LGBTQ community, we still do have some white privileges in some situations. For example, as Dave Chappelle points out within the special, many LGBTQ folks, especially LGBTQ folks who are not visibly LGBTQ, will still feel perfectly safe calling the cops. Something few, if any Black people would ever feel comfortable doing, for reasons that should be obvious if you've been paying attention to the news media for the past 2 years. It's a very good point that Dave Chappelle is bringing up here. And he even goes even further, bringing up how feminist movements often ignored Black voices as well. So not just the LGBTQ community, but feminist movements as well.
There's a problem in that feminist movement, isn't there? From its inception in America, there's always been a racial component. When Susan B. Anthony was having that meeting and Sojourner Truth's Black ass showed up, read your history books. All them white women asked Sojourner Truth not to speak. They didn't want to conflate the issues of women's rights and slavery. But you know how Black bitches are. Sojourner Truth went up there anyway.
As Chappelle points out, Sojourner Truth was a powerful women's rights advocate who was often sidelined in white feminist spaces because she was Black, and not given the same access to opportunities because she was Black. So within all of this, Dave Chappelle is navigating this thread of how there's a complex intersection between LGBTQ discussions, feminism, and how we often elevate the topics and interests of white folks within these communities over Black folks at the expense of Black folks. And he is right in all of that. All of it, I think, is a very nuanced, interesting point that he's really trying to dive into with this special. And I think it shows how smartly and how willing to broach these topics he is within his special. With all of that being said, with all of the praise that I just heaped on what he was trying to do and the points that he was making, it is exactly the fact that he gets all these points that I think, when it comes to his voice on trans issues, it's why I find it so disappointing when he talks about trans issues. Because Dave Chappelle is so intelligently aware of the cross-sections of privilege elsewhere, and yet he just misses it when it comes to understanding the same for many trans people. So first and foremost, going all the way back to the first point that I made, yes, Dave Chappelle is navigating discussing trans issues in a way that many folks are in these conversations on trans issues in a complex way, in a way where they don't always get it right, but are trying to be affirming and trying to learn. But at the same time, he is a huge public figure with a huge platform who is admittedly very self-aware of the fact that he knows that he's gotten called out for transphobic discourse. He knows that he has done wrong in the past, and he knows that he could do wrong in the future. He's hyper aware of that fact. He brings it up himself. So he should know that using his platform to perpetuate these types of jokes can be really harmful. In fact, they already have been harmful. His TERF jokes, the fact that he's said he's on Team TERF, has been used by TERFs and many conservatives to lean into this idea that, oh, look, aren't trans women and the leftists, aren't they awful? They're just trying to cancel Dave Chappelle. They're just denying the fact that gender is a thing. It's the same tactic that they used when J.K. Rowling's essay came out. It's this whole idea of painting trans issues versus women's issues and now being able to point to like, hey, they're coming after Dave Chappelle. And it feeds into this culture war clash instead of actually looking at the nuance and substance of the issue. It's painting Dave Chappelle as the victim in this circumstance when he himself said that he researched TERFs for the special, but somehow missed how harmful of a group they are. And yes, TERFs are good at obfuscating. They're good at obfuscating the harm that they cause, which is why I talk about them so much, because I think it's important to bring to light how harmful they are. But he is a man with a large platform, and I cannot not call him out when he normalizes their rhetoric. Because that's what he does. He presents what they're saying and what they say about trans women as just something that appears normal. But if he did any real research on to TERFs, he would know that this is at the very least, he doesn't have to agree with me that TERFs are awful, but at the very least, that it's way more nuanced than the way he presents it. So yes, he is navigating trans issues in an understandable way for someone who does not have the platform he has, but he does have that platform. And so we need to be aware of how that platform normalizes this type of discourse. Because intentionally or not, his platform is being used in a way that he knows will be polarized because it's happened before, and he knows it will be weaponized in this culture war clash, even if he wants to be affirming to trans people. And he knows that while he's understandably learning to do it best, it does not give him a pass to perpetuate this stuff on such a large platform, because it will and has been used to be weaponized in ways already against a marginalized community. It's really frustrating because this exact tactic of trying to drive a wedge between trans issues and women's issues that Dave Chappelle is playing into is the same tactic that's many times used to try and drive a wedge between the LGBTQ community and the black communities. Like, for example, anytime this sort of stuff happens, where a black man says something that could be deemed transphobic, there's this idea that gets propagated around that somehow black men are more homophobic or transphobic than white people, which is not true. According to the Public Religion Research Institute, nearly 3/4 of black Americans believe that gay and trans folks in the US face discrimination, which is compared to only 54% of white folks. And this framing of black people as more homophobic also denies the fact that many black folks self-identify as LGBTQ more often than white folks do. Or it also denies the fact that many who wield institutional power to push anti-gay and anti-transgender legislations are also typically white and white-supported lawmakers. And this idea of black men being more homophobic already comes out of these pre-existing racist stereotypes of black men being violent, aggressive, uncaring, or unempathetic. And so this sort of idea, this idea that black men are more homophobic, isn't real, but it's trotted out all the time in order to pit two marginalized groups against each other, the LGBTQ community and the black community, instead of recognizing the truth of the matter, how the black and LGBTQ communities often overlap and often face similar issues and work alongside each other quite often. And it's what TERFs are doing right now with women and trans issues, trying to drive that wedge between the two communities. And again, it's really frustrating that Dave Chappelle plays into that exact dynamic when he's so self-aware of that dynamic when it comes to the LGBTQ and black communities. Because I think that that exact idea of that wedge between the LGBTQ and black communities is the exact thing that he's trying to break down within his special. He's trying to build a bridge between the LGBTQ community and the black community by pointing out how often the LGBTQ community is ready to push down black voices. And he's right. And I appreciate that he wants to try to build that bridge. Yet when he does so, he's addressing the LGBTQ community as a monolith. And he's not recognizing how trans people are a part of the LGBT community, yes, but still marginalized specifically within the LGBTQ community, as well as society writ large outside of the LGBTQ community. How often trans people also sit at this hard intersection of privilege and lacking privilege. Many trans folks, black or white, don't feel comfortable calling the police if we don't pass as cisgender, if we don't look like a cisgender person, because police are also likely to ignore trans people or even use police brutality against trans women. It's a very similar dynamic, utilized more often against black trans women than white trans women, but white trans women definitely face it. We've seen it numerous times and on numerous occasions throughout the past few years. And again, as I said, this also ignores the fact that trans people are marginalized within the LGBTQ community. A large amount of TERFs self-identify as lesbians, and many TERF-aligned groups like the LGB Alliance in the UK actively work to push out trans people from the queer community. Even further, Dave Chappelle ignores the realities of black trans women and other trans people of color and how they intersect with this as well. Black trans women are often the most marginalized voices. You will rarely find, as I said, black trans women centered in any kind of discussion. Black trans women are also among the highest at-risk group to be murdered, with 44 trans women being murdered last year and 21 so far this year, most of them being black women. Not to mention the fact that TERFs themselves as a group typically only focus on the issues and needs of white upper class women, with only lip service paid to black issues at all, if ever. The very feminists that Dave Chappelle calls out earlier in his special for not platforming Sojourner Truth because she was black are the same type of feminists that he says in this special that he is on the team of. So, all of this is why I found the discourse surrounding Dave Chappelle's special to be deeply frustrating. This issue is more than just Chappelle made transphobic jokes, let's cancel him. Because I don't think canceling him or removing his special from Netflix is the answer, because I think his special hits this really difficult place. It reflects this really difficult place that I think we're all navigating right now as a society when it comes to talking about marginalized issues. I think Dave Chappelle's special in many ways is incredibly smart, insightful, and depthfully aware of how black folks are marginalized even within minority communities, and how they can often play out in intersecting ways across feminism, the gay community, and elsewhere. As he says jokingly in the special,
whoever ever watched me know that I have never had a problem with transgender people. If you listen to what I'm saying, clearly, my problem has always been with white people.
And even at the end of the special, he shares a very, very, very moving story of his trans friend and comedian who committed suicide after defending him publicly. It's awful. It's awful that this discourse gets riled up in that anyone defending him is seen as just as akin to the worst person, when all they're doing is trying to be empathetic to a friend who is coming from a very complicated place. And so at the end of the special, Dave Chappelle asks for empathy from the trans community, because these types of conversations that frame the discussion as adversarial, they aren't helping anybody.
LBGTQ, elemental PQIZ, it is over. I am not telling another joke about you until we are both sure that we are laughing together. I'm telling you, this is done. I'm done talking about it. All I ask from your community, with all humility, will you please stop punching down on my people?
We're polarizing further and further on these issues and not listening to each other. And I hear him on that. I want to have those empathetic conversations too. That's the whole goal of what I make on this channel. I want to have the type of conversations where we can move beyond simply framing his words as transphobic, devoid of context, because it doesn't engender those conversations if we do that. And Dave Chappelle is navigating trans issues in a way that is relatable to a lot of people, wanting to affirm trans people but not fully aware of the nuances of all the issues. And I get it, I understand it, and it's worthwhile to see that. And yet, at the exact same time, that's the issue. That's the problem. He's a man that so gets the nuances in other areas but completely misses them in others, specifically around trans issues. And his lack of understanding of how these issues interact with trans people specifically, especially for trans women of color, is deeply saddening, because he gets it so well elsewhere. And the stakes, unfortunately for him, are just higher because he's not an average guy trying to deal with and figure out trans issues. But he's a guy who has a large platform, is on Netflix. If everything he said was said in a private conversation with me or other people, I would be right there for him. But putting it out here publicly as a person who has the respect of so many people because he is a smart, intelligent man normalizes the culture war and feeds into the culture war and feeds the side that is doing direct harm against a marginalized community, against the trans community. So the stakes for him are just higher, even if I understand him as a person navigating these issues. And it's frustrating because I don't have the answer here. I wish I did. I wish he could be given the grace to deal with these things publicly and not have us all shred this up in the stupid culture war that I just very, very, very much hate. I wish I could just have a simple conversation with Dave Chappelle about these issues, because I think we would understand each other. I think we would get to a place, and I feel like I would probably learn a lot from talking to him. I probably have a lot to learn, especially when it comes to these issues, as much as I try to understand and be empathetic. I'm sure there are many things that I missed, even within this video. I think he's a guy who's open to that, and I think he wants to have that in a public way. And yet we live in a world where once someone is on a public stage, it's going to get torn to shreds and be feeding into that culture war. And you have to be careful then with what you say. And I just don't feel that he was careful and empathetic when it came to trans people, even though I think his goal was to try to be. And it's frustrating because I want to understand and I want to be empathetic in that way, but I also have to stand back and be like, this is harmful. Even though I find the thing that you're trying to do to be an important thing to have in the discourse. Because sadly, you're just going to get weaponized into that culture war. And I'm saddened that the biggest outcome of Chappelle's special will most likely be to further that culture war instead of creating the exact empathy that he asked for, even if he asked for it imperfectly. We're all people trying our best. I don't want to seem so nihilistic about it, because I do hope that Dave Chappelle's goal is reached, even if I think he did it imperfectly. And I hope that's what this video does too. Create those conversations. Do not just call Dave Chappelle's special transphobic. Do not just call Dave Chappelle an awful person, a transphobic person, a comedian who needs to go away and be canceled. Maybe he should, as he said in the video, stop talking about LGBTQ issues until he's ready for them and until we're also ready to have a conversation back with him. And I think that's a mature thing to do. I just wish he hadn't made this special before he actually got to that point. But regardless, the special's been made, and I think we should use it now to spurn conversations about what he got right and what he got wrong, what we can learn from him, and what, he and people who, reflect how he feels about these issues can also learn as well. Don't just say Dave Chappelle good or bad. Just like few, if any, people are simply good or bad. Let's navigate this imperfectly, because that's what we are. Imperfect. Just trying our best to empathize with people. Thank you so much. I hope this video was helpful. I know it was long. I don't know how this is going to do. I'm just going to be honest and say my videos have been doing super well in the algorithm, and so I hate to be the like and subscribe person, but please also like and subscribe. It would help me out. But beyond that, I really just hope that this video does good and helps people. So thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoy the rest of my content. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper, my friend. Hey there, my patrons. I see you. Thank you for supporting me now. It's October, so I thank you so. I couldn't do this without you. It kind of sounded like Scooby-Doo, right? Anyways, here's your names, patrons. I love you so much. Jem, Shin, April Stirk, The Blessed Rain, Sarah Sweeney, Tony the Author 13, Morgan the Pirate Queen, Joe Herman, Holt, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg, Maas, Kathleen Lambeth, Ashley Allen, Bo Kiki, O.D. Cassaray, Jetty Indiana Jones, Stephen Kleinard, Alex Miller, Ish the Mad, Randy Thompson, Wellington Marcus, A Man Chooses, A Slave Obeys, Mary Mello Bays, Boyd Earl, April Struck, G-Man 42, Joseph Dewey, Chloe Dollar, Felicia Toast, James Crivdell, Elizabeth Christian, Seven Schuhart, Dominic Noble, Aaliyah Kai Gooch, Jessica Wright, Sonia Nero Purdue, Nathiel Fraughton, Peter Landers, Jared Johnson, Ferangato, John Steele, Wendy's the Bizzle, Celestial Dawn, Barbara Heelchuck, Geek Filter, W. Randy Edie, Piston Twisted Garage, John Witherby, Eva Kaniva, Meadow Whisperer, Melinda Walters, Ulysses the Pagan, Tiffany Danger, Casual Observer, Lysa, Alex Owen, Beatrice Purvis Flynn, Keith Briggs, Megan the Goblin, Emily Loomis, Odd Just Odd, Lamia, William Stewart, Angie Pugh, Jessica Chapman, Andrew Lamoureux, Gretchen Badger, Amanda Ronya Adanya, Sarah Bystam, Laura Demero, Kalesis, Sky Skinner, Fritz Steven, Hieresis, Noble Monster Comics, Jacob Tovar, Nathan Steele, Mary Mack, Sarah Sweeney, Jason Knott, Sean Pipier, Ship Machine Berlin, Maeve, Andrew K, Polly Mina, Strawberry Pup Tart, Lily, Rainier Amlani, Crit Fax, Nikki Gordon, Bloomfield, Chris Overbeck, Michael Hardy, Zone Librarian, Michael Godey, Jenny Marble, Pay Steve, Philip Hawkins, Mark Brown, Andy H, Corey and Vale, honkin' in. Kinda lost the Scooby-Doo of it all, but thank you so much, patrons. I love you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful Spooktober. I'm a dork.